Anna Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, heal your inner child. I want to skip a lengthy introduction and tell you immediately who my guest is because, number one, I want you to get to the meat of the interview, and number two, I feel like many of you would know today's guest very well. But first, I want to thank one of my longtime listeners who introduced me to today's guest a few years ago. Lauren Thomas. She used to be the community manager for our Facebook group, the Authentic Parenting Community, and she has appeared on the podcast a couple of times before. Once, she did an on-air coaching call, and I believe she was the first one to do an on-air coaching call when that offering was available. And another time, she interviewed me for the 200 special episode. Of course, I'll have links to both of those episodes in the show notes. Today's guest, Dr. Nicole LePera, aka the Holistic Psychologist, was trained in clinical psychology at Cornell University and the New School for Social Research. She also studied at the Philadelphia School of Psychoanalysis. As a clinical psychologist in private practice, Dr. Nicole LePera often found herself frustrated by the limitations of traditional psychotherapy. Wanting more for her patients and for herself, she began a journey to develop a united philosophy of mental, physical, and spiritual health that equips people with the tools necessary to heal themselves. She's the creator of the hashtag Self-Healers movement, where people from around the world are joining together in a community to take healing into their own hands. Her first book, How to Do the Work, has resonated within the community, and now her second book, which is a workbook, is coming out in December, if you're listening in real time. I truly enjoyed this conversation. It's rich, insightful, and powerful on how to do the work, heal your inner child so that you can meet yourself and live your most authentic life. Please enjoy. I am delighted and very honored that you're here to talk to me, and my listeners are anxiously awaiting this podcast episode because I learned about you through my listeners a few years ago, and so I'm sure they're so delighted. I want to begin by asking about the inner child. People use this term these days, just like other buzzwords and trendy words. But I think I love the way you approach this. And of course, your explanation, I want to hear from you. And you have archetypes. So let's get into this a little bit. What is an inner child?
Absolutely. So I want to first thank the listeners who introduced you to my work, Anna, and also to thank you. Even the nature of this podcast, anytime I hear anyone talking about parenting, sharing, these tools to change or to give resources for all of the parents out there, I'm so inspired. So I'm truly honored to be a part of the work that you are doing, because to speak to the point of parenting an inner child, I think this is one of those areas that can be really, really transformative for us, whether or not we do have children in this world, or if you're like myself, I'm someone who is choosing not to have children. The reality of it is, even if, those of us, I'm sure many listeners are in adulthood at this point, we all have an inner child within ourselves. And the simplest way I describe what an inner child is actually a space that lives in our subconscious part of our mind. So exists outside of our awareness, though that contains all of the habits and patterns we learned in childhood, mainly around our emotions, how to tend to our emotions, what emotions are okay to express and what emotions aren't okay to express. And the reality for a lot of us is that we have what I call a wounded inner child living within us. If we didn't have a consistently present and attuned caregiver, which is a tall order for all of us, for all of you parents out there, if we didn't have someone who was, centered, grounded, knew how to meet their own needs to the extent that they could then show up and be a model of grounded safety and support to meet someone else's needs, chances are there was lackings, limitations, needs that we didn't necessarily have that were consistently met. And then no matter how many decades beyond childhood we may be, all of that lives imprinted again in our subconscious and comes up into our adulthood, whether or not it's in how we tend to our emotions or how we just show up in the world in general. And this is where we can get into, I'm sure, as this conversation evolves a bit, talking about the archetypes and these very conditioned patterns or ways of being that really impact how we're showing up. So the simplest way, again, to understand inner child is it's the space in our mind where we're carrying the impact in our mind and body, I should say, where we're carrying the impact of our earliest childhood experiences, specifically around adaptations or ways that we once had to make or keep ourselves safe. And we're continuing again to repeat those in adulthood. So we carry that wounded space with us, even though sequentially in terms of our age, we are so beyond those childhood errors. And then of course, when we're talking about parenting, that then translates to how we're showing up for the kids that we're raising around us.
And I ask you something, do you think positive aspects of our childhood are also imprinted, and we also have those parts as part of our inner child, and they do come through? Of course, we don't pay attention to the positive things, right? Positive sides, but do you think if we did pay attention to that, that would be another route to getting to the inner child?
I believe that all aspects of our experiences are carried with us, positive, negative, neutral, everything in between. The more consistently something happens, and again, oftentimes it's carried with us outside of our awareness. We don't even realize the impact. And to speak to your point, oftentimes we are overlooking the positive aspects of things we learned in childhood, or resilience, even the ability to tolerate very stressful experiences and come out the other side. A lot of us do tend to overlook it, for one simple matter being that it just becomes what we're used to. And we can be a little bit like the horse with blinders on, right? If we only have experienced ourselves in this one particular way, even around something maybe quite positive, if that's the language we would like to use, that's the only way we know ourselves. And I think it can become really hard to acknowledge then that which becomes just so part of our blinded lived experience. And I think parts of just kind of piggybacking on this idea of positive aspects of our inner child, I believe that we all have access to, I think probably some of the aspects that you might be referring to or listeners might immediately think of is playfulness, imagination, creativity, which maybe for a lot of you listening feels like something that you haven't related to or resonated with or experienced in quite some time. And maybe you're even of the belief that now that you're a quote unquote adult, there is no room for creativity, playfulness, imagination, and anything in between. And I could make an argument that that space within us is part of the human experience. And if you're not, as I once did not relate to those experiences. I was not joyful. I was unable to be creative. I was unable to imagine, pretty much anything in terms of a future that was different from the life that I was continuing to repeat. Talk about playfulness. It was really difficult for me to even find joy or laughter in daily experiences. And again, chances are if you don't have those maybe perhaps positive aspects of your inner child present in your current life, it's not because you've grown out of that. It's, again, in my opinion, at least, it lives likely within the trauma, within the adaptations that I was just describing that we're carrying with us. Really simply, we don't feel safe enough to access that part of our inner child. Though, again, to speak to your point and question, I think, a bit, that is a positive aspect of human existence that is available to us regardless of how old we are. And if we don't have access to it, the answer might live in, again, dysregulation or a lack of safety from that early environment where I just don't feel safe enough to relax into that space now.
Yeah, as a kid, like what kind of kid were you? Did you have a dream of becoming something? Did you even had space to dream about of a certain profession, or like who were you? Like looking back, I know you mentioned many times you don't have a lot of memories after doing a lot of work. I'm wondering, like, who were you as a little girl, and what were some of the qualities that you can remember?
Yeah, I really appreciate you asking this question, Anna. And the best way I could describe myself as a little girl was a little girl afraid of the world, quite literally. Talk about dreams, aspirations. I was, so fearful, whether or not it was of something bad, a health ailment happening to my mom, my dad, crimes happening in the city in which I was living. I was very much always primed for one of my family repeated mantras was always something. And that was really emblematic or indicative of the climate of stressful, overwhelming feelings and really a limitation or a lack of ability to cope with those. So by the time my mom found out she was pregnant with me, which wasn't until she was 42 years old, my dad was 45. I have two siblings, my sister who's 15 years older than me and my brother who's 18 years older than me. By the time I came along, the best way to describe my whole family climate and environment was locked in survival mode. So by the time I was born, I was very much a very anxious little girl, always afraid of bad things happening. I was painfully shy, so much so that I would hide behind my mom's leg when I was out in public, and, neighbors who, knew me and familiar with me would be saying, "Hi, Nicole." And I was hiding myself behind her. And the way I understand it now, of course, I thought I was just a shy person. I was just an anxious person. Again, all of this wired into what I believed was my genetics, inevitable to become this person. I now understand it was such a testament to how unsafe and unsupported I was. So you wouldn't have heard me talking about joy, about dreams, about passion, about purpose. I became what led me, I think, into the journey of even becoming a psychologist was my interest and curiosity, mainly around probably keeping myself safe to some extent, trying to understand other people. I was so fascinated in the mind and what made people different than I was, similar to the way I was. And again, I now understand it. It was my attempt to understand the very confusing, overwhelming things that were, happening around me. So while on some level, I do think I was intuitively marching my way to being, right, my purpose and passion, which was to become a psychologist, I do actually believe that all of it, from being the shy little girl, afraid of the world, with no real purpose or passion, all of that was, again, an adaptation from a very unsafe feeling environment with a lack of support.
Yeah, there is a part in your first book, How to Do the Work, where you're already in California. You moved from East Coast to West Coast. I love this part in your book, where you are walking and it's a beautiful day, you're listening to music, and all of a sudden you start to move your body and dance a little bit. And then you immediately revert back and think of a time in your childhood where you took a ballet class and you never liked dancing after that, and because you looked in the mirror in this ballet class that your belly was bigger than other kids. And when I read that, maybe I should read that part actually, because it's so beautiful. It shows that the whole transformation journey, how we have to do the work today. And there is a line: I stood there seeing finally with the open eyes of consciousness, learning how to connect to my innermost wants and needs, and for the first time, truly trusting in the infinite possibilities of the choices we are gifted in any given moment of time. And that's what I want to talk about, the choices we are given at any moment of time, right? That you discovered that in this moment, that it's no longer about your childhood or going back or mending, repairing. It tells me that you already are healing, right? You knew what this meant. Do you want to comment on this, on the story or the sharing?
Absolutely. I just had a whole plethora of experience over here. Everything from Anna, when you first started to describe, me as this young girl in ballet class in particular, and then began to read that. I actually was brought back. And what came up for me a bit, even just hearing you read that now, is what I would describe as a feeling of sadness. And the way I understand it is, from very early on, I was very involved, very active in a lot of different activities. And very early on, I discovered that I was quite gifted athletically, in softball in particular. And, my mom being my closest, attachment figure. She was the one who was home with me, who was raising me. And she was also very emotionally disconnected herself. However, when I was performing, when I was exceeding, when I was showing up, and excelling at softball, my mom was at all of the games. She was cheering me on. She was very engaged. So while I did many things like dancing, like art, very quickly I determined what I got the most feedback for, what I felt the best doing then as a byproduct. And I kept doing it. So before long, I stopped doing ballet. I felt very insecure in my body, another theme throughout my life. And I became more and more disconnected from that body, which is where, my actual true interest and passions live. And it took me until I began to heal and to become conscious of why I spent so many decades of my life disconnected from my body, because I didn't feel safe in my body, because I didn't feel secure in my body. And because, again, I was so reliant on external feedback to how my body was performing, or how someone else, imagined or deemed it to be performing, that I relied more on that feedback than how I felt. So the sadness I was feeling when you were reading that was really understanding those moments now through a different lens, through this little being who was so lit up, and still am, and returning to my body, being able to be safe enough in it that I can hear music and allow myself to dance and to move the feelings through my body. I actually think that is quite, a passion connected place for me to be in, and is still, though I disconnected myself so quickly from that, because, again, it wasn't getting that external validation. So I have a lot of feelings, I think, revisiting, hearing, seeing all of these, again, conditioned ways that I've shifted from what I really like, what I really want, in favor of how the world was responding or was reacting to me. And again, this is just a prime example of what happened in the moment in real time, which is why I'm describing it here live, was a moment of that inner child awareness, right? Of being able to pull back and identify, things that are of interest to me, and all the different reasons why I might not have been living, making those choices. So to speak to the point around when we limit ourselves in choices, it's because of an accumulation of our past experiences, where we begin to become familiar, much like those blinders we were talking about, of ourselves in this one particular way. We wrap all of these different identities around us, again, usually grounded in the way that we've had to once adapt or modify ourselves to keep us safe. But then they become the cloak of who we are. And before we know it, outside of our awareness, we're very much limiting the choices we can make, because I'm this type of person who only does this type of thing, right? I became the overachiever softball player who only showed up in instances where they could excel. And I shut myself off to all of the other, or I limited my choices to all of the other aspects of my being. And the more we become present to all of the wounding, it doesn't mean that everything I just even described to you that I was feeling was anything less real. Everything I just emotionally even went through right now and I'm discussing right now is very real. And what healing to me entails is becoming conscious of that wounded inner child. For me, carrying pain, carrying remorse, seeing all of the ways I wasn't in service of my wants and my needs in favor, right, of showing up for someone else, allowing all of that to be the pain I'm feeling, and allowing myself the opportunity now to make a new choice. Maybe I do want to continue to sway my hips and step out, right, of those limited boundaries of identity that so much of us have come to identify and ground our choices in. So really, healing again is opening ourselves back up to the reality that we might be being impacted by our past. Though if we can ground ourselves, we can then open up the door of awareness to see how many possible future journeys we can make.
Yeah. I just was reminded of a story from my childhood, which I may or may not share, but I'm going to turn it into a question or an opening for an exploration, rather. How much of our childhood wounds, right? Let's say you were at the ballet class, you see yourself in the mirror, you have this, you just compare yourself, you see something, it's not like because your parent is not there. It's not because of your parents' misattunement per se. How much of our wounding is because of our own temperament, as opposed to pinning it everything on our parents? To clarify this, I'm not asking this in a great way because I'm thinking in real time. When I was a kid, I think I was maybe in third grade, I was very scared of the Invisible Man. There was this movie, right? There is a book, there is a movie, and it was very popular in the 80s. And my school took me to a circus where we saw the Invisible Man do some tricks on stage. Man, I was so scared of the Invisible Man. I could not be home alone, which I was often left because, parents used to work back then and no one was home. I was scared to walk to school back. That fear was so enormous. I was just terrified, right? And I never told my parents. And my parents were not the parent that you're describing, disconnected from themselves. They were interested in me. They were tuning. They were really nurturing from what I can remember. But somehow I never disclosed that part of me to my parents. So that's what I want to know. Like, how much is it because of who we were as kids and how we interpreted the world based on our own perceptions and temperaments that created wounding in us? And how much of it was because of our parents?
Yes, I think it's a really, really great question. And, I will oftentimes speak of and, honor the uniqueness, the temperament, whatever we want to call it, our resting state of being, which includes our emotions. And our emotions are very much information in terms of how we're navigating the world. We're each going to feel differently and navigate different instances in a different way, have different emotional reactions to it. I believe that the goal of, parenting or really any relationship, specifically though parenting when we're shaping a developing human, is to create the space for a curious exploration of those individual uniquenesses or essences, to create the space for things to be explored, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, actions, desires, interests, and whatever it might be. And then there, of course, is an interaction. How safe is that space? And that then communicates to the child how safe then the child is to bring things to the surface to explore. So we are never in a vacuum, right? Even though we are born with inborn tendencies, we're born into, in my opinion, an environment that begins in utero with the literal first environment that we're raised in. That's awash in different chemicals with our mother's now nervous system that's going to impact our development. So we're never kind of in absence of a relationship, or at least a relationship with an environment. So there's never really a way to, it's like the chicken or the egg, right? There's just such an interaction between the two of them. Though again, the goal being to have that open safety where children can, bring thoughts to mind, explore different ideas, share how different experiences within the home, outside of the home, made them feel, and then find their way through what responses, kind of attune to or tailor or work for the uniqueness that is that human in time. So, it's more of a container, I think, kind of function of parenting. And all of that really is reliant on how safe the parent themselves has felt over time to be who they are, to explore themselves in that way. And so again, all conversations are an interaction, in my opinion. I don't believe we can hang. And whenever I'm even talking about the role a parent or a relationship in and of itself might play, it's never with the intention of blaming. It's with the intention of understanding, again, that dynamic interaction between a unique individual with their own wants, needs, tendencies, interests, curiosities, and the environment that they will be growing, developing, and exploring themselves within.
Yeah. When we talk about emotions, right, this comes up a lot. And we did a whole support call a few weeks ago about anger and expressing emotions. A lot of people say, I was not allowed to feel or express my feelings, right? We can all relate. Our parents were not there to attune and regulate with us and things of this nature. But like, I'm often wondering, what emotions are we talking about? Are we talking about anger mostly? Are we talking about sadness? What emotions were not tolerated? I think anger is a big one, right? Because was sadness allowed? Like, what emotions were allowed in your home, or what emotions did you express or feel? Which emotions were the ones that, like now looking back, you wished they were mirrored and attuned? I'm always like trying to understand this. I did a poll on Instagram the other day in my community. I said, what's the hardest emotion that you are dealing with like today? And most of the people, surprisingly, I thought it's going to be anxiety, but it was the anger that people chose. And there was a few fear. Sadness was not even mentioned, that it was a multiple choice. I think it had only like a few people, but predominantly it was anger. So that's what I want to explore a little bit. Are our parents afraid of all the emotions, or is just the anger, or what are we talking about here?
I think it's important to, first locate a discussion when we're talking about emotions, with kind of acknowledging first what we're talking about. Because I think emotions, feelings are one of those words and concepts for some of us thinking can get a bit confusing. And when I'm talking about emotions in particular, and the reason why I talk about emotions in particular is because they're actually grounded. The 6 core emotions, at least, are grounded in evolution and contain evolutionary information. Emotions, to be clear, are sensations, shifts, changes that happen in our body with our muscle tension, with our heart rate, with our breath, with the hormones, cortisol being a stress emotion, with different neurotransmitters going through our body, giving us then a visceral or a body-based experience. And they are then a evidence of our interaction, of how we're experiencing the current environment around us. And what I mean when I say is they're grounded in information. For instance, if we were to meet anger or be exposed to anger, usually we're receiving information that our needs aren't being met, or that we're having a limit or a boundary is being violated. If we're having an experience of sadness, usually there's some information or an experience of a loss, a perceived loss of an actual thing, a relationship, an expectation, right? Something that we imagined or wanted to be the case now isn't. Of course, I'm really simplifying it. Surprise, again, another core emotion, is when we have an expectation and it's violated. We're literally surprised by an experience that we're having because we were anticipating something else. So it is important, I believe, to have an understanding of what emotions are, again, because they are information. A lot of us, I do think, have this idea, maybe because of how we were raised in our childhood homes, where there wasn't space for healthy expression of different emotions. We might have had maybe an experience where little to no emotions were talked about. That's how my family home was. If we weren't talking about the latest thing to worry about or the latest stressful thing, usually in a complaining based kind of engagement with it, right, where we're just talking about the stress that we're having, nothing else was talked about. There was no conversation or expression of sadness, of anger, except for the momentary explosions where my dad would be screaming or yelling, or my mom would stop talking to me when the anger got too built up. But there was no discussion of, I'm angry. Here's why I'm angry. Let's talk about resolving anger on the other side of it. So emotions, again, have value. the way we navigate our emotions, or even whether or not we're experiencing or allowing our emotions into our experience, really is going to be impacted with what we were modeled in childhood. Now, if you are someone who's listening that's like, yeah, Nicole, I'm relating to you. I don't really feel much emotions at all, or all I feel is stress, or I don't have moments of these other emotions that you're saying are kind of part of my experience. It's not because they're not happening. It's because you're probably so disconnected, again, likely because you had a disconnect at some time in some place from the emotions that are living in your body. And once we attune back to our body, then we can, see those moments of anger and those moments of sadness. And so if we really want to narrow it down, I think to more directly answer your question, I believe humans in general, I'm going to make a really global statement right now. I believe we struggle with emotions, period. I think that we all have dysfunctional ways and we have very limited abilities to tolerate stress or emotions, that we have things that we do. We habitually yell, we scream, we disconnect ourselves, or we isolate, or we ice people like my mom did. We stop talking. Or again, we dynamically just avoid our emotions altogether. We're just so disconnected that I quote unquote never have emotions. And the reality of it is I don't believe that even as adults, very few of us have a regulated access to all of our emotions and an ability to process them in a functional way. So understanding emotions have impact, really understanding what our relationship for our emotions is, and understanding again all the different reasons why we might not be having this connection to our emotions. And again, maybe for some of you it is anger is a really particularly difficult emotion to deal with, or for others it might be sadness. So again, I'll go as far to say I believe truly that most of us adults struggle to control, to manage, to regulate, because again, controlling doesn't mean suppressing. It means having our emotions, getting the value, the information that's within them, and still remaining connected to the ability to be responsive, not reactive, to show up in alignment with how I want to cope with the emotion in this moment.
What are some ways for someone to start this process, this work of learning to tune into their feelings and slowly feeling them from your own experience, maybe? Because I would be curious to know what were some practices, exercises, steps that you took, and describe how arduous that journey was. Because like if we didn't have the ABCs, how can we read chapter books now, right? As adults, like we have to go back to the basics. Number one question is that, and then how important it is to know, like people want to know, why am I feeling this way, right? Instead of just feeling the sensations and just being with the bodily sensations. I think, in my opinion, I would insert my opinion here. I don't believe that we do need to know the why or the story behind it. Like, no, it's not necessary, right? To feel the emotion and develop that tolerance slowly and become acquainted with certain emotions. So talk to me about your own journey a little bit. For someone who came from that upbringing, right? Your emotions were not mimicked and you grew up in this cold, I guess, I don't know how to describe, environment. What was it like for you when you started the process?
It was a journey. I think that's a best way to describe, because before I even, I think intuitively, we do want to know a lot of times why we're feeling the way that we do. And specifically, even more importantly, we want to know how to stop feeling the way we do and shift us into feeling a different way. And my answer is not going to begin with those, I think, more kind of objective, directive things that many of us are seeking endlessly for. The way that we can heal our relationship and develop emotional or stress tolerance, the ability to, like I've been describing, have a conscious relationship with our emotions and remain responsive in how we express them, is by first building back a reconnection with our body in which those emotions live. And that is in and of itself a journey. When I came to the awareness or became conscious of how unconscious I was, how in autopilot, disconnected and dissociated from my body that I had been for so long, my journey began not by tending to my emotions first and foremost. It began by setting a daily commitment to reconnect with my body. And so for me, that remains foundational in my journey. That somewhere in my day, typically for me, it's during the mornings, where I carve out time where I'm tending to my physical body, where I'm learning how to have a conscious relationship with it, which for me meant learning how first to create safety in my body. Part of the reason why I spent little to no time in awareness of my body was because my body was tense, was a stressed out, a ball of stress that had been accumulating for decades of time. It wasn't a safe place or a comfortable place to be in. So when we're talking about becoming present in our body, that doesn't necessarily, for many of us at least, mean I just, oh, okay, let me turn my attention to my body. That means while I'm doing that, I'm learning how to make my body safer to be inhabitable. I might need to do some breath work or some grounding type actual body-based tools and techniques to shift the signals that my nervous system is sending in my body from one of stress, get out of your body, keep living life right in that autopilot, to one where it's a bit safer to be connected. So when I say a journey, that means the daily process of building those choices in so that my body can and doesn't happen overnight. It's not like the light switch of, oh, my body's not safe. Let me do some deep belly breathing for 5 minutes and now I'm safe again. Absolutely not. It means day in and day out, make sure I'm feeding my body the nutrients that it needs. Make sure that I'm gently moving my muscles the way they do need to be moved, that I'm also resting and sleeping my body the way it needs to, kind of fall into that relaxation so that I can restore and repair. That's the things I need to be doing day in and day out so that I'm intentionally making sure that I'm breathing calmly and deeply, not from shallow in my chest, just keeping myself in that stressed out state. The more consistently I build in that foundational safety in my body, right? I just described a lot of things that we have to do consistently, more consistently than not. Then over time, I can feel safer to turn my attention and my awareness to then those emotions, to how I'm feeling in my body as I'm going about my day, as I'm having this difficult conversation with a loved one, as I'm, choosing to show up in this context, in this aspect of my life, right? That only becomes possible when I'm first connected to my body. So we make the daily commitment to create safety so that we can turn our awareness so that over time I can then open myself up to what my emotions, how they are being experienced, and what information they could have. So to specifically answer your question, then it doesn't necessarily mean where it's coming from, because I do lack memories, as a lot of us do. The more disconnected we've been in protection in childhood, the less likely we are to retain memories, not only because our attention wasn't there to put the memory or to encode the memory, if you will, but because of stress. One of the major hormones of stress, cortisol, impacts the memory area or the hippocampus of our brain. So really simply, the more stress goes up, the less likely we are to be able to recall those moments. So we don't actually need to revisit the movie screen of the bad things or the overwhelming things that happen. We don't even necessarily need to know the why that we're feeling the way that we are right now, even though it probably does connect to those overwhelming things that happened in our childhood. We can tune into what is happening now and use the information in the present moment to then determine what happens next. Because in my opinion, overanalyzing, revisiting, hyper-focusing, trying to spend so much time in my mind figuring out is still an action of my thinking mind, not my conscious awareness where this new choice lives. I'm still now locked in a different version of my mind and not actually in my body at all.
Oh, love this. Love this, how you went to the body and consistently and slowly developing body awareness, right? Recognizing and learning about your body, developing that safety, and then slowly tuning in. It's reminded me, it's Halloween season here, and I'm like, wow, yeah, she's right. Like, you can't just go into this haunted house and check out all the rooms. It would be so scary. You need to first go around the house, see what's going on, what's lurking, then maybe just open the door and peek into the house, right? And then slowly you can open one door and be still scared, and then the next door and learn about the emotions. So thank you so much. This was such great explanation. I love it. Another question I have is about labeling feelings. I think there is room for labeling our feelings, right? Like what we're feeling. But here is what my thinking is, and I want to know what you think about this. Also, having been on this journey with you, trying to acquaint with my body and then feeling my sensations and all of that, I think there is room for labeling what we're feeling. But in my view, it's not in that very moment. Like I'm feeling sensations. I think it's important to note and observe what we're feeling, the tension, the tingling, the warmth, the physical aspect of the bodily sensations. It's great to tune in, to note, to observe, and just breathe and expand and see how it dissolves and disappears. I'm okay with that. In that moment, I don't want to bring in language. I don't want to say, oh, what am I feeling? Is this sadness? No, this must be, no, 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 no. Let me look at Brené Brown's book that there's like a whole dictionary of emotions. I think emotions and labeling emotions have a place post feeling these sensations, when you're already retelling the story, either to yourself in your journal, speaking about it with your child. I think labeling then is important. And even then, we're not going to be accurate, right? Like, I don't know, like this feels like anxiety, but it could be something else. So comment on what I said.
Yes. Yeah. I like, I'm resonating, Anna, with the way that you're thinking about it. And I think the kind of direction, or what I want to ground, the conversation and your suggestion in, is the reality of when we're in that thinking language based type of our brain, typically associated with the left hemisphere, right? We're in a different part of our brain than allows us to be connected to our body's internal sensations, or our inner sensing, or our interoception, as it's called. And that's typically associated with our more intuitive right hemisphere of our brain. Of course, our hemispheres have the ability, or at least the large majority of us, our hemispheres have the ability to communicate and give us a whole comprehensive experience where we can have awareness of sensations or inner sensing that's happening and shift over and give it language in real time. Though that's what we're doing. We're now lighting up two different parts of our brain. And I think the large majority of us have spent the whole of our life in that logical left side, thinking, over analyzing, overthinking part of our brain. And when we're in the visceral experience of our body, when we're tending to our emotions, or when we're having our emotions, I think the way that you're thinking and conceptualizing it, of kind of staying with that more sensory based, physical, right brained, intuitive part of our experience, I would agree is beneficial. Because for the simple fact, again, of most of us spend, and because of Hebb's law, right? Neurons that fire together, wire together. Our left side, again, I'm really simplifying neuroscience here, but our left side, our left hemisphere is overworked, overused, and few of us are spending or are comfortable dropping into using and reconnecting with those more intuitive senses. Language can have help, benefit. It can give us an understanding. It can be a point of communication, right? We all agree upon more or less within individual variation what certain words, feelings, sadness, things like that mean. Though again, I often like to bring up the variation. I learned something very early on in my clinical training that sticks with me to this day, and I apply it more globally than it was intended in the conversation. And the conversation that I had with a particular supervisor who knew my own personal story of having anxiety for as long as I can remember. Like I was talking about earlier, a little girl scared of the world. And I was talking about a particular client who also came in for some presenting problem around anxiety type symptoms. And we were talking something about their case, this client, and knowing my own personal history, somehow the topic of anxiety generally was brought up by my supervisor. And she made a suggestion that again sticks with me to this day. And that suggestion was, Nicole, especially when you hear a client speaking to you or sharing an aspect of their experience that sounds similar, and the more similar it sounds to your experience, the more I'm urging you not to assume or allow your subconscious mind, which is what it will want to do in that moment, to fill your story and overlay it on theirs, to essentially assume that because of the similarity in how it was for you. And of course, the more similar it is, right? I hear a client talking, oh, I'm anxious. I have scary thoughts happening in my childhood. Oh, wow, that's so similar to so now I make them me, little Nicole, right? Having the exact experience that little Nicole had. And I sometimes don't create the space or the opportunity to hear the ways in which it was different, that it wasn't actually as similar as I had thought it to be. So I apply that and expand that to our brain does have that function. It's going to, because it's the quickest way we can assess, scenarios, we can assess our safety is by batching and grouping things together based on their perceived similarity. And again, this is one of those areas where we're going to be coloring the world from our perception, from our subjectivity, and we're going to be missing those moments where it isn't as similar as it was. And again, though, that's a function of what our brain was going to do. So I think, and I apply that suggestion all of the time, which is really honoring the subjectivity that each of us are bringing to our experiences.
Yeah. So when your mom passed away, was it before the pandemic or it was during the pandemic?
She passed away last, so it was 1 year in May, so a bit over a year.
Yeah. I remember on social media, you were very vulnerable and open about it. But I want to ask you a question about this. It was the point in your life where you already did work, right? A lot of work on yourself. From this emotional standpoint, how did you process that loss, having already done work on yourself and develop some body awareness and emotional literacy and all of this? And of course, you can't compare to Nicole who hasn't done the work. But I'm wondering, do you think if you hadn't done the work, it would have been worse, or would describe the experience for me, first of all. So I don't know how you processed or how you dealt with it. And was your training or your work, do you think, helpful in how you navigated that time?
I honestly, and I can't imagine and know that in no way of mincing words, things would have been felt. I would have navigated the years preceding my mom's, ultimate death and especially around her death so differently, because so much of how I show up in all of my relationships, especially those with my core family members, my mom, my dad, my sister, changed, transformed as I began to come to the awareness of all of, again, the different ways in these relationships in particular that I didn't have space. And I was continuing to contribute to limiting the space that I had in terms of showing up, honoring myself, my needs, my limits, and, what I wanted for my life and for those relationships. So again, saying all of that to say that a big part of my healing journey, actually before my mom even got sick, which ultimately led her to dying eventually, though she had been chronically ill my whole life. And I actually ended my first book, How to Do the Work, with the very transformational and difficult decision that I had made to separate and to cut off contact with my family as a unit. It ended up being for probably about 18 months of time, though at the time where I did request that space, I did it via email, not confident in myself to be able to communicate, being fearful that I was going to be guilted right back into or feel so badly creating these new limits for myself that I was going to be right back into those, dysfunctional behaviors that I was identifying weren't serving me. I asked for space via email. And when I did so, I did not know ultimately what was going to happen next, if or when or how even, or if my family would then be open to re-engaging, reconnecting, and trying to rebuild our relationship on the other side. And so flash forward in time, while they were, of course, surprised and hurt by my decision to take space, they also were able to create a bit of space for understanding. And in the interim of time, when I was continuing to, create boundaries, to learn how to take care of myself so that I could show up as a more compassionate, connected human in my relationships, they too began their own healing journey, began family therapy, began individual therapy on their own, and, began to really explore some of the dynamics that I was bringing to the surface that would no longer work for me. And then long story short, re-engaging, it ended up being about 18 months. I sent an email, very vulnerable, no idea or expectation of how they would even receive or what was going on for them. I had no contact for that 18 months. I didn't know if they would even
Not
be on
even
the
like
other
intuitive knowing you didn't have.
I mean, I went everywhere from imagining life exactly as I left them to obviously, having a kernel of hope that things, that my leaving might have been enough for them to, because before I left, there was many different attempts I had made at putting up boundaries, attempts I had made at, communicating some of these concerns that I was having. So I was hopeful that, was a seed that was planted in terms of them, taking the torch and beginning to look at some of these patterns. Though again, while I could have all of the intuition myself, I was very grounded in the reality that I think is a tougher one for us humans to tolerate, which is that I didn't actually have control about what they were going to do next. I only had focus and control around what I was going to do and how healthy and balanced I could make myself, so that when and if I did decide to rebuild a relationship, that it would be a different version of me, understanding that I was just as much contributing to us being in those stuck family dynamics as they were. So I was taking ownership and responsibility of doing my part, and really helplessly not knowing what they would do with the now space and distance that my separation had created. Lo and behold, again, they had began to do the work. And part of my journey, and wrapping this in, of course, into my relationship with my mom, one of the biggest awarenesses that I had, unbeknownst to me, was how emotionally disconnected I was from my mom and from my entire family. While I now have this language and use it readily to describe, I was, my mom was not emotionally attuned. We could even call me a victim of childhood emotional neglect in many ways, right? This isn't language that I had up until more recently. So without that language, right, I wouldn't have said I was emotionally disconnected. I actually thought the very surface stress-based cycles of quote unquote connection that we were cycling around in my family was an emotionally, right, deep relationship. So one of the things one of the major pillars of healing for me was getting honest, was really starting to become consciously aware and allow in the pain of what wasn't for me, right? Some of us are traumatized, or we carry the wounding in our minds and our bodies of things that happened to us. And then others, of course, have more of the byproducts of things that we didn't get, needs that weren't met. And for me, my whole emotional world, there was just simply no space when the family was locked in survival mode. So for me, a lot of my healing, while my mom was still physically present here on earth, was mourning the loss of that relationship, was mourning the relationship, the connection that I actually never had with my mom. So by the time now we're reintegrated, she's become, me and my family are back in connection. We began to communicate first in the context of family therapy sessions, and then, translated that relationship out, because part of it was functioning with new boundaries, with new limits. All of the work that I did outside of relationships with my family, I now needed to honor in those relationships as well, which meant showing up for me in a different way. And a lot of that then meant showing up and engaging with my mom in a different way. And all of that transformation ultimately led me to, by the time the last several years of her life, and her cancer diagnosis turned into treatment, turned into many different medical complications, turned into the inevitable end of her life, I was in a much more centered and grounded and capable place of continuing to hold space for how I now felt about this very real physical transition that I was experiencing with my mom. Also keeping myself, that space for myself to tolerate and to deal with how I felt, acknowledging that my whole family is going to have their own individual reaction to losing my mom as well, because they have their own dynamic relationship with her too. And part of the thing that we lacked, that I was working so hard to change, was that space for those different experiences. So when I say I'm transformed, I mean, navigating, I don't know how I would have navigated even our relationships as general leading up until the end. I imagine probably very codependently, not having any space, little to no space, at least for my separateness of how I felt, and likely no awareness of this deep rooted wound that I had been carrying, compensating for my entire life.
Wow, thank you so much for your honesty. Yeah, it's really moving to hear the story, and it sounds like that space was needed. I don't know, for all parties to heal and to repair some way. I love stories that end like that. I want to ask you like a bit of a woo-woo question, I guess. When you cut off a family, when you cut yourself off from your family, or move across the country, or move completely to a different country, do you still think that we are energetically connected to the people, to our family members, and there is still influence in our life? Because I feel like we're part of this constellation, and no matter how much we, move away or put borders or create boundaries, do you think still there is some cosmic or energetic, I don't know, way that they're still there? It's like you're never free from that stuff.
Yes, I could not agree more. And even back to right this idea of self, authentic self, right? Who is this that we are? I think this is like one of the age old questions, and of the human existence. Like, where is that at space? What makes us us? And while science is advanced in a lot of ways and advancing, and I'm really fascinated by whole quantum world of quantum physics, quantum science, because I think that comes closest to defining in material terms what the stuff is that we're made of. And in actuality, it's not stuff at all. It's energy. At our core, in our essence, I believe, pumping through our heart, one of the most incredibly powerful organs in our body, with the largest electromagnetic field out expanding up to 6 feet, around us, is we are the essence of energy. We are in interaction, and we become our physical bodies, right? Mass and matter and energy all are two different sides of the same coin. So to then the woo-woo answer, and thankfully, because my very scientifically grounded mind likes to have a science, and now we do have the science of the quantum physics world, and of the quantum reality, which again is the science of energetics. So the most less woo-woo, kind of taking this from the woo-woo talk and kind of buffering it a bit with the science of energetics, of course, grounded in the quantum world and in quantum physics, though translating into the day-to-day lived experience of how connected we are. I'm sure some listeners have probably had the occasion of thinking about someone, whether or not you want to be in contact with that someone or not. And lo and behold, you open up your email or your phone, and there's a text or an email from that person, right? I think that's a very common experience of what in the science world is that non-local communication, that idea that there was some communication, right? Why did I just have suddenly a thought when there's this email that I didn't physically see, right, in my inbox? And I think that's a lived experience testament of this energetic nature of our connection. Something pinged somewhere that I somehow knew right outside of my awareness that this communication was happening, even if this person was in a different state, country, on the other side of the world entirely. So the simple answer is that yes, I believe we are all of the same energetic pool of existence, no matter how. There's actually a lot of fascinating, I could geek out about this all day long. There's a lot of fascinating science now about that non-local connections, about us in terms of our energetic, form and ability to communicate across, continents with other people. And it really can get really fascinating and grounded in science. So simply to answer your question, I believe we are more connected than we are not, whether or not that's the loved biological ones that we share our genetics and environments with, that we've left to move on the other side of the world to maybe put distance from, or others that we don't know. I think that there is a joined nature of our connectivity that speaks to the point of, even if we are physically distant, there is still that connection, whether or not it's the whole conversation we've been having about it living in our habits and patterns that we are maybe repeating, keeping that environment alive, or again, the more undefinable, unspeakable scientific nature of that energy that lives within us, even if we are physically distant from those humans.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I want to ask another question. What are some of the things, if there are any, and I'm going to assume that there are things that your parents gave you? I mean, we always focus on we didn't get this from our parents, like that narrative. I want to shift the conversation a little bit and say, what did you get from your parents?
I think what personally, I've gotten from my parents is innumerable. I do agree with you. I do think that a lot of times we focus on lacking, what we didn't get, what's not present. But I mean, everything from, the security of knowing that I had protection, the roof over my head, that, consistent human that was accessible, where I could find them, whether or not they were emotionally able to fully be present to me or not. I mean, that is a huge privilege. I'm, very aware of that. I had that degree of self-protection and of presence in my home. I think even though a lot of it was connected to my mom's own wounding and my dad's own wounding and their own past experience. One of the at least spoken, testaments was, being kind, being compassionate, really showing up as a selfless or other serving human. Now, of course, I've revamped my model of how we can become that person. It's not from squashing ourselves only to serve another person. We do have to make sure that we're meeting our own needs and we are, a self-contained, safe individual to even be able to serve another. So while I would modify a bit, there was so much value in that because I truly know at least one of the reasons we've been so successful as a human species is our ability to connect with others, to live in collaboration and co-creation, to be, and our heart allows us to be open, compassionate, and connected to another being. So in a lot of ways, that was very much professed, in my family. And the attempt was to live, though, again, without this information of how important it is to be grounded, to make sure our nerves are met, our nervous system is our needs are met and our nervous system is regulated and that we can tolerate our own emotions. And this whole conversation, again, that we've very beautifully had today, the mechanics of how my family attempted, right, to be or to embody that very compassionate, selfless serving of others human did not ultimately allow that to be the case. Though, again, I truly believe we are imperfect humans doing the best that we can with the information that we have. So from a very well-intentioned space, there was a lot of learning and wisdom that I believe all of us do bring with us from our childhood environments. Again, though, but to speak to your point, I think it's so easy to focus on lack, what I didn't have, the, negative fallout. And I think sometimes we do lose focus of the rest of our story and our picture. But that's, again, not to mean to just shift focus and bypass the pain, wounding, and hurt that we are carrying either. That's also not the solution, to become so hyper-focused as I see a lot of us are ourselves or suggest others to be, to only look right at the bright side. I can think that can not necessarily do us our service as well. It's important to see the fullness of our experience.
Yeah, agreed. Future self-journaling. I want to ask you about that since this is something you invented, right? You worked on for yourself and it became very popular. You have a journal. Do you still do that practice?
So future self-journaling, actually, I was journaling just this morning.
Oh my gosh. Can you share an example, or can you share maybe what you journaled today, how it's done, or from previous days, or is it too private? It's like so incredible to know. It would be incredible if you could share, of course, instead of just giving like a theoretical answer. I would appreciate that a lot more. If you can give us a glimpse of your life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I actually, not being someone who, I think traditionally the way we think of journaling, dear diary, get my thoughts out, get my feelings out, that's never been something that I've resonated or engaged with, just for no, I mean, I'm sure if we really went to unpack it, there's probably many different reasons why I didn't, though. I was never that person. So I just like the preference, because I do think that some of us really resonate and love journaling and, and have that actively in our lives, and others have all different experiences of journaling or beliefs about what it is or isn't, and don't necessarily have that as an applicable practice. And I was of the latter. It wasn't something that I did daily or even did at all, really. However, I started to think about understanding, again, the power of our habits, the importance of creating new habits or making new choices so that I can begin to actually transform or change my life. I started to experiment with how can I build in a kind of more action-based way to journal every day. Or first it was, how do I come up with a tool, really understanding journaling and the power of creating change through the written word, through affirming future choices. The reality being our mind doesn't know. If we're writing something as if it's already happened in that moment, our mind believes it actually has happened. So I dug really deep into neuroscience and the power of neuroplasticity and habit change and how to get really consistent with creating new habits. And what I landed on was a way to utilize a journaling practice that I eventually entitled Future Self Journaling, to set a daily commitment every day to keep what I call a small daily promise or a new intended action plan for that day. And there's prompts and an expanded comprehensive guide to get you started with some frequently asked questions, some example journal prompts, all on my website, theholisticspsychologist.com. If you sign up for my email list, you will get sent the entire Future Self Journaling practice package to get you started. But really simply, it's the action of setting a daily intention. I will share with you my most recent ones in a minute, but setting an intention of changing, journaling in the morning, in your afternoon, or somewhere during your day, that intention, journaling it as if it has already been completed in the present language in that moment. Again, we're already laying down some new neurology, the first part of a neural network of as if it's already happened, because in that moment, your brain doesn't know the difference. Now, not only did we bring to our conscious awareness this new behavior, remembering that my autopilot's ready to go. It's going to take me through my day, whether or not I intervene or not. So now I've already brought to my conscious awareness this new intention. Oh, right. I don't want to do that old thing. I want to do this new practice somewhere in my day. I've journaled about it as if it's already happened. So I've already rehearsed it, mental rehearsal. I've already laid down, a network of, okay, this is completed and checked. And then I can set myself up to take the next step, which is, again, it's not a magic journal, but having done that somewhere in my day might set me up to keep that promise, whether or not it's, 5 deep belly breaths somewhere in my day, or hitting pause for a moment of silence, or, drinking that glass of water as soon as I get done journaling that I want to do. I've reminded, I've rehearsed, and now I'm making it more likely that I go and do the thing. Because again, I want to emphasize for a second time, there is no magic anything out there. It's not a magic future self journal. There's not going to be a one-stop shop where it's done. Though doing this daily, and I've done the Future Self Journal more consistently daily than not since I began it. I, of course, changed the new daily habit that I want to work on. I usually keep a daily habit consistently as the same thing I journal about every day. I keep the same intention for days upon days until that becomes integrated as the habit I do more often than not. So what I'm now journaling about looks much different than in the beginning. The beginning of my Future Self Journal was a consciousness habit. I am practicing. I am a conscious being. And for me, it was I'm consciously tuning into my breath. And I set the daily commitment for one time throughout my day to set an alarm on my phone. And when that alarm went off, I was going to tune into where my attention was and then refocus my attention on my breath. And I was going to do 5 deep belly breaths. That did 2 things. It woke up my consciousness now 2 times while I was setting the intention and during my day. When that alarm went off, now I'm conscious. I'm conscious to myself. I'm conscious in my body. I'm conscious in it breathing. By that point, I knew that my body was so dysregulated that I could do some intentional breathing, some deep belly breathing to help calm what for me was an overactive, overstimulated nervous system. I kept that promise each and every day for well into several months until somewhere in my day, I more or less always remembered to become conscious of myself. And then I built another promise into that practice. So now flash forward several years into my Future Self Journaling. And of course, you can get the prompts, you can get the how-to, you can get some sample plans to get you started on the website. Several years into it now, I'm typically also reminding myself of that daily consciousness habit because that is always a foundation. And typically just this morning, I've been journaling about staying connected for me into my heart space and making sure that I'm taking moments throughout my day to reconnect with my compassion and my heart. And I journal about that intention. And then somewhere in my day, I'm making sure that I'm not just keeping myself busy from one thing to the next, that I'm having that moment of quiet with myself, with my heart in particular.
Wow, this is great. Thank you. What I'm feeling from you is a lot of good, like a big gush of energy, even though we're doing this over a screen, but I can feel this unfiltered on that you are sending me this fulfilling, I would say I'm getting a lot of fulfillment I don't want to say nourishing because it sounds a little passive, but more energizing in a fulfilling, enriching energy from this conversation. That this is like, I wrote down 3 words: enriching, uplifting, fulfilling, while I'm listening to you, and you are very present. It's like, it feels so great. I can't describe how amazing I feel right now. I feel like expanded and like spacious, but like full, but also energized. It feels great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
No,
transmitting that energy to me.
Thank you, Anna, for sharing that with me. I mean, literally, my cheeks are hurting, smiling, hearing you say that. Because for me, again, that is such a living testament of the work that I'm doing, that I'm attempting to embody. I think what you're describing is in the experience of being with someone when they're in a flow state. It is as if, right, I'm paying very little attention to what, if any, to what's happening around me. I'm into what I'm saying. I'm just communicating in a very free way without all of the different levels of censoring that so many of us do, that I once did myself. So that's why I'm ear to ear, because there were few instances where I felt just so free in my past, at least, that was just to speak. I was always vetting, always worrying about how I would be received on the other end, and not really able to embody that state. And I think what you're beautifully describing, again, back to this idea of energy and communication, is how we are energetically communicating. So just as much as you're feeling uplifted and inspired, right, by the energy that I'm embodying, just having this communication with you, right, virtually, not even in the same physical location, I'm sure many listeners can have had the other experience, talking to someone who's down, low, heavy, constricted, and having that then translated as well. And again, that's a prime example of how we're all in energetic communication with people, and how I truly believe, and the reason why I'm probably so impassioned about this is how I believe we change the world. If we can become more embodied ourselves, more able to just be who we are comfortably, freely, safely, and exhibit and allow and express our gifts, our passion, our purpose in the world, then we are going to be those domino effects. We might be impacting others that are even outside of our physical communities with our energy. As we're shifting and changing, in my opinion, the world shifts and change right alongside of us.
Oh my gosh, that's such a beautiful place. I don't even want to ask further questions. I'm like, wow, that's so great. It sounds like this mega message that you want to end the show on. But I'm just going to put a tiny question. What were the biggest influences on you, like books that you read in the beginning, or a mentor or a coach or a spiritual teacher, the first breadcrumb that you found on this journey of self-healing and transformation? I would like to know that, I think.
Yeah. So the first breadcrumb was left. Well, the first breadcrumb I would say I would attribute to probably the work of Dr. Bruce Lipton, who really exposed me to epigenetics. And again, the reality of that interaction between all of the different biology and genetics that we're born with, and its interaction with the environment around us. Because for me, coming from that old system of belief that we were really, again, our options were limited, that our genetics were the sole determinant of everything from our physical to our emotional health to even our personality. For me, and I believe that wholeheartedly. I saw evidence in myself and in my generations and my family. We all did appear very similar. It was very easy to say, oh, okay, well, this is because genetically, right, that is what is determining this. So forgetting that we were also repeating the same environment, the same modeled behavior day in and day out. So that breadcrumb literally burst open a door of awareness, of knowledge. I dove into, right, the science of the mind, the body, the nervous system, what a role that actually plays in determining everything from our, the daily, the way we're thinking, to our entire way of being. And so for me, again, it was learning about epigenetics. And I believe that the work that I was exposed to, because I think he does an excellent job at translating it in very understandable language and applicable ways to utilize the information, which is Dr. Bruce Lipton.
How about books? Can you share any books that were influential on you?
Yeah. So I'm blanking on what his main, Dr. Bruce Lipton's book is, though. Another book that came to mind, The Biology of Belief, is a really, really great book. Becoming Supernatural, I read as well, really highlighting Joe Dispenza. Then I dove into him Greg Braden, again, really starting to go into the power of the mind, of consciousness, dropped into the heart, really got involved and exposed with HeartMath. And their incredible research on the power of the heart. So it was kind of like one springboard into the next, though. The Biology of Belief, I think, is a really, really great book. Breaking the Habit of Being You is another one. I have so many books. They're all flooding my mind right now. But
that's good.
Books
That's
me
good.
were really,
Yeah.
really impactful.
And what are you reading now?
Oh, right now I'm not. Well, actually, I am. I'm finishing up Gabor Mate's The Myth of Being Normal, while I'm also finishing up writing my second narrative book on relationships, which will be out next December.
Oh, wow. That's going to be something on relationships, general relationships or romantic relationships?
On relationships in general, really exploring, of course, romantic relationships get wrapped up in there, but really exploring the neurobiology, a lot of what we've been talking about, how a lot of the habitual ways that we're showing up, whatever type of relationship it is that we're engaging in, how, again, they're impacted by our childhood and how to really return to that heart-centered being. And really, it's called How to Be the Love You Seek.
Oh, wow. Love the titles. Well, as we conclude, do you have anything to ask of me? Do you want to share a particular message or a question or anything that you want to leave this conversation with, just to bookend this conversation with? Like, what rises for you?
Yeah, I want to thank you again, Anna, for these conversations that you're having, especially again around such a huge topic, job, role, journey, and so many mission, purpose, passion, all the things as parenting. That's what I view parenting is. It is, like I said, a tall order. And it really does involve, and even, you inviting me on to have this conversation of how, us as individuals factor in terms of being the role of the parent and all of the ways that we can continue to show up for ourselves so that we can then be that domino that impacts those future generations. So I want to share gratitude mainly with you for having these conversations, for having this community of parents out there, of other individuals who are so directly impacting these future generations. I get so inspired as I see more and more of this work happening, and I'm just so grateful for you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We're on the same mission. Thank you. Have a lovely day. And I'm going to carry this beautiful energy that you emitted to me, that uplifted me and energized me throughout the day. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you so much.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. What's your biggest takeaway? Did this conversation resonate with you? Did you find it useful? How can you apply what you gleaned from this episode into your own life? I love hearing from you. I welcome your feedback, comments, and questions. Send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. Call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, there is a free tool on the contact page of my website called SpeakPipe. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact and send me a message. I do prefer audio because I want to hear your voice. If you enjoy the podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Your ratings and reviews help us get more visibility. If you want to join your fellow listeners from around the world and engage in meaningful conversations about the podcast, get support and answers to your parenting questions, take advantage of our bi-monthly free support calls, join the Authentic Parenting community on Facebook, a private support group for parents like you. Do you love the podcast and find it helpful? Show your support by becoming a patron on patreon.com. With a small monthly contribution, you can make a big difference. To learn more and choose a level of support, go to patreon.com/authentic parenting. Again, patreon.com/authentic parenting. Again, patreon.com/authentic parenting. Join other active members who believe and support the work of authentic parenting. Currently, we have 20 members who together contribute $98 towards our monthly goal of $500. You can find the show and follow it wherever podcasts are played: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and elsewhere. And finally, if you want to know what I'm up to in my private life, see behind the scenes of podcasting, get inspiration, and just stay connected, follow me on Instagram, the only social media platform that I use. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.